My name is Cathal O'Donoghue. I'm the Professor of Social and Public Policy at the University of Galway, and I'm a Programme Director of the BSc in Agricultural Science there. I was delighted to be asked by Dolores Meany of Clare Library to speak as part of the Decade of Centenaries programme of events. Over the past couple of years, I've undertaken research on Irish agriculture over the last century, and today I will focus on what happened in the 1920s. When you look back upon the last 100 years, the agri-food sector has been the most important sector in the economy, at least for the first half. But we've seen very significant changes over time. If you look at the sector now, it's a major exporting sector in dairy and beef meat in particular, modern farming sector, with a large processing sector. However, it wasn't always like this. And in the story we look at now, Ireland in the 1920s, Ireland was a very different country at that time. The Decade of Commemorations marks a century of Irish independence, which is a momentous event. But that period that we're remembering spanned years or even decades of very significant change in the country. In the 1920s, we went through a war of independence. We'd just been through a civil war. There'd been World War I before that. There was ongoing land struggles, going back to the land leagues and the various land acts, and we were establishing a new state. So it was a time of immense turbulence. And I guess one of the stories of this presentation is how remarkable the 1920s were in that agriculture was maintained despite all the changes that were happening in the rest of the country. And that is essentially the story of the 20s. Stability in surrounding change. Ireland's first government, the Communal government, was relatively conservative. Its primary economic policies were relatively frugal, balanced government, balanced budgets, good government, good governance. Increasing industrial expansion built around the existing natural strength in terms of agriculture, and a little bit of tariff protection, although more of that came later. But the primary focus was increasing agricultural production, but at least maintaining production. The difficulties in looking back at the 1920s is the availability or lack of availability of official data. The first measure of agricultural output, the value of what was happening in the sector, didn't come until 1926, 4 or 5 years after independence. Although there had been data for 1908, data wasn't produced again until 1929-30. So in the decade of analysis that I use here, I draw very significantly on work of Bob O'Connor and Cathal O'Donoghue, who in 1985 tried to fill the gaps by producing a series of estimates from 1913-14 up till the end of the decade, with some gaps in between. I'm going to start first with a bit of context. The situation of Irish agriculture in 1920 and where it came from. It largely moved from having a high degree of tillage production to a mainly cattle system by the 20s. It was a system that required relatively low labour input compared to the situation that would have existed before the famine. And we saw a very significant loss of agricultural labour in that transition from tillage to cattle, and consequent emigration of rural populations since the famine. And by 1900, the sector reached a period of stability. So between 1900 and 1920, the nature of the production, the structure of the sector was relatively constant. The production of cattle and related products like milk is really the dominant form of production in the Irish agriculture sector. Even the tillage sector, much of what is produced is used to feed animals, both cattle and pigs and poultry to some extent. And if you look back at the period to the famine, the lighter green graph in this graph here describes the number of cows, which was actually pretty flat between 1855 and 1930. So these are the breeding animals. The change we did see, however, is an increase of non-breeding animals, the darker green line, which gradually increased over time as more animals survived, but also animals were held on and reared for export, and that was probably the biggest change in the period up to 1900, and that was the situation that existed at the start of the decade in the 1920s. Get a wider century perspective in this graphic here on the right, describing total cattle and the number of cows divided up into dairy cows and other cows, so cows that produce milk and cows that produce animals for meat production. We see that the start of that century in the 1920s was relatively stable. It was a time before the volatility around the economic war in the 30s, before World War II, and before the expansion that occurred after the Second World War in the run-up to join the EEC, and then in the early years of the EEC, where there was dramatic change in the sector in terms of the number of cattle, at least. That ongoing transition from tillage to cattle continued during this decade, although in general the relatively small changes. Cattle, or pasture for cattle and sheep, was pretty flat over the entire decade, with the area used for tillage crops declining. If anything, sheep production was even more stable than cattle production, which was itself relatively stable, being almost flat over the entire decade. The 1920s was a period of political and economic instability, and we see declining prices for farmers in the goods that they produced. We see there for crops and turf a steady decline from 1912-13 through 1924 and 1929, so a steady decline. For livestock and livestock products, it's slightly different on the left there. There was an increase in prices from pre-World War I up to the 1920s, but thereafter there was a decline in livestock prices across sheep, cattle and milk. And that decline actually happened a little bit earlier. The prices peaked in 1920, so most of that growth in prices occurred around the time of the First World War. But this decade that we're looking at, the 1920s, saw a decline in prices for the products, but it was also matched by a decline in input prices as well. So it was a situation more general in the economy that prices were falling. This graphic describes the volume changes. So this is the amount of production independent of the prices, and describes it for livestock, crops and inputs. And we see a decline for livestock and livestock products in 1924 relative to pre-war. And this was largely due to very poor weather conditions that year, with quite high mortality. We saw a fall in animal numbers, but that gradually recovered in terms of total volume of cattle, sheep and milk products and pigs over the decade. So by the end of the decade, it was more or less the same as World War I. For crops, however, it was different. We saw a steady decline over the decade, with quite a significant fall relative to the First World War, nearly 20% down, and that, I guess, reflects the lower prices that farmers were receiving for crops. At the time, the structure of the crop sector was quite different to the way it is at the present, with potatoes, turf and oats being the main crops. And inputs more or less tracked the livestock, so they fell when animal volumes fell in 1924, and it rose back up more or less in tandem with the other sectors over the rest of the decade. Combining prices and volume, we get total gross output, and we see quite a big change before the First World War in 1924. Even though the volume output didn't change that much, the prices had risen, pushing up output. It fell back in 1925 with a decline in prices, and it came back slightly to slightly below the 1924. So a slightly different story between volume and total output due to those differences in prices. Combining crops and livestock, we get total gross output, which exhibits a similar pattern to livestock and livestock products, as that's the dominant output. And then subtracting inputs, we get net output, which again follows that pattern, a rise between 1912 and 1924, and then a slight fall and moderation out to the remainder of the decade. So it's certainly not a decade of massive advances, but it did more or less maintain output and incomes over that period. And with relatively low inflation or even falling prices, it maintained the standard of living of farmers over the decade of the 1920s. We can look down to local levels using sensitive agriculture data that was produced every 5 years or so, where we know the land use and animals and things like that at county level. And so comparing Clare to what happened in the wider state, we see that the changes in land use more or less mirror what we see at national level. We see falls in oats, potatoes and crops in general, and more or less flat hay and pasture. In Clare, if anything, it was more extreme in that the share of oat production fell, as most of the oat production that reduced were in western counties, which had poor climatic conditions and wetter land for tillage production. Potatoes, which were important, fell about 10%, and minimum change to hay and pasture. For cattle, the situation in Clare was similar to the rest of the country, reasonably flat or slightly declining numbers of cattle, but the number of cows was maintained. The number of sheep, while it rose in the state, fell in County Clare, and similarly with pigs. One of the defining stories of the century in Irish agriculture has been the very significant restructuring we've seen, as the number of farms has steadily decreased over time, and particularly the number of small farms. And we see that in the 1920s, where the number of farms fell from 359,000 in 1915 to 338,000 in 1930. And the other line gives the share of farms that are less than 15 acres. And that declined at a faster level than most other decades. So that restructuring of the smallest farms was very visible in that first decade. And it was very strongly associated with emigration due to, I guess, push factors of lower standard of living on farms, that people are attracted to work elsewhere to get a higher standard of living. In this graphic, I present the wage rate for agricultural labour. It was just defined by the state in England, Wales on the left, and in Ireland on the right, between 1914, 1925 and 1929. So there's a gradual increase. And what we see in Ireland over the decade is a narrowing of the gap between the two countries over time. However, the agricultural wage rate doesn't really reflect the wage rate of very many farmers. Typically, as we see later on, the incomes of farmers was lower than that of labourers. And with the high birth rates and the amount of people living on farms who were contributing to the farm, the incomes of relatives, or relative assisting as they're known in the data, were even lower again. So requiring supplementation from other sources, growing of food for their own consumption. But these low incomes relative to labour and indeed what could be achieved in urban areas and abroad was a very strong driver of rural immigration. And this rural immigration, it was itself, it fed back remittances so there was a steady flow of income back into rural areas from people who were living abroad. But also within the household, it increases living standards because there were fewer people to feed, essentially, from the resources of the farm. Mirroring that decline, or even accelerating relative to the number of decline in holdings over time, we see a decline in farm labour. In 1926, there were nearly 700,000 workers in agriculture. There's 250,000 today, and today they're mainly not full-time. There's about 150,000 labour units. So a very significant decline in the agricultural workforce over time, particularly the number of farm labourers. But in the 20s, we hadn't seen as much change, so essentially there were fewer holdings but similar numbers of workers. Although we've seen a steady increase in mechanisation over the century, as tractors were increased and other forms of machinery increased in their use on farms, in the 1920s it was still very much a manual exercise, farmers and their horses. We see that in time each tractor replaced about 2.7 people and 2.8 horses. So that's one of the drivers of the reduced labour force. But there really wasn't that much change, at least in the Republic in the 20s. It was still pretty manual. One of the big differences between now and then was the presence of subsistence farmers. Subsistence farmers are farmers with land less than 50 acres where no commercial activity, farming activity, could be said to exist. And the graphic on the right describes the share of subsistence farmers at different hectare sizes. So all farmers 1 to 4 acres were subsistence, most of the 5 to 14 acres were, and the majority of 15 to 30 acres were relatively few in the 30 to 50 acre category. So these were dominant systems in the West and the Northwest in particular. And although there's no data from the 20s, because there wasn't that much change between the 20s and the 50s, the first National Farm Survey gives an indication of the types of incomes that these farms had. So on average, they had €3,500 in current prices, so in 2022 prices, of farm income. But a lot of that was food that they produced for themselves on the farm. The average cash income was 1,278. So these were extremely poor farmers with very little cash. One of the consequences of having such a high share of subsistence farmers living on small incomes was pressure to access land. And this connects the 1920s back to the process back to the land leagues and the various land acts right up to the 1923 Land Act, which focused on disbursement of lands in large estates and holdings. And there were very, very significant pressures across the country, particularly in East Connacht. Also, as you can see from this quote from County Clare, there's a prairie of untenanted land in Clare. There are poor men in uneconomic holdings. There are bogs unevenly distributed, ranches in the hands of the very few. These must be partitioned and divided into lots to make what was uneconomic economic. So this is an ongoing narrative over the course of the 20s that continued for some time afterwards. The consequence of the extent of subsistence agriculture in Ireland was the share of produce that was consumed on the farms themselves. Before 1950, unlike today where the majority of food that we produce is exported, less than a third was exported by agriculture. In fact, 30 to 40% of farm that was produced on farms was consumed on farms. So we could see in the earlier numbers that a lot of the output produced in farms wasn't sold, but consumed by the family themselves. Another difference with the present is the nature of dairy farms. Nowadays, dairy farms are big commercial mechanised operations, whereas in the 20s and the time up to about the 1960s, dairy farms were often very, very small. 1 or 2 cows were very significant. 1 or 2 cow farms were a very significant portion of the population. And you can see it in the type of products that were produced. Back then, farmhouse butter was a very significant output from farms that was produced either in the farm or in local creameries. And that was largely replaced in later years by milk products, butter, cheese, powders produced in larger scale creameries. So that reflected the nature of that small, close to subsistence agriculture at the time. Another very significant difference at the present is the nature of beef. Back in the 20s and again in that period up to the 60s, most of the exports of beef cattle was in the shape of live animals crossing the Irish Sea to Britain to be fattened and processed there. It was only later that significant processing of beef for export occurred in Ireland. This graphic describes the pattern of exports in Ireland. There are three graphics. Part A describes the export share of agri-food, so it's a proportion of food products that are produced in Ireland that are sold overseas. In the first few years of independence, in the 20s, we actually saw a decline in the share of agri-food production going to export, as more of it was consumed within the country. In the middle graphic, we see the share of agri-food exports that goes to Britain. That actually increased for a period, and we were almost entirely reliant on mainland Britain as a destination for food exports. And the last graphic, graphic C, we see a steady decline throughout the century of the share of total exports coming from agri-food, including the 20s, where we saw initial industrialisation after independence. Profit in the agri-food sector comes not only from what's sold, the output, but also in terms of costs. And the main direct costs are feed, fertiliser and seed. In the 1920s, the sector was a relatively low input sector, with about 14% of outputs spent as inputs. As the sector mechanised over time, that share rose, but it was relatively low in the 1920s. One of the main inputs to agriculture is the amount of fertiliser that determines to a large extent how many animals you can keep on land. Some interesting work by Doc Walsh, one of the first directors of Teagasc, saw that there was relatively little fertiliser applied in the early part of the century. Low fertiliser use, and so there was a net extraction of nitrogen as you took animals and plants and milk off the land. So the soil fertility was declined over time. The use of fertiliser grew slowly at this point, taking off later in the century, and this effectively resulted in less labour rather than higher outputs. There's a particular parallel between the 1920s and the 2020s, and it relates to the exit of one of the countries from a wider union. In the 1920s, it was Ireland that exited from the United Kingdom. In the 2020s, it's Britain exiting from the EU. And it's interesting to consider parallels. I guess in both situations, there were no tariffs on exit, which is positive. That was the case when Ireland left the UK. That lasted for about a decade until the 1930s, when there were greater pressures and there were wider economic crises. And then there was, of course, the differences between Britain and Ireland in a number of dimensions, including annuities. At this point, higher tariffs were brought in on food, and there was the economic war during the 1930s. When Ireland left the UK, there was a common currency. So I guess one of the risks in leaving a bigger economic entity is that there can be more challenges and more risks. Ireland, to a large extent, had long-term stagnation for the first few decades of independence, until we joined another economic union, the EEC, in the 1970s, where gradually over time Ireland has moved from being a relatively poor country to a wealthy country. If you look at the present decade, when Britain exited the EU, currently food exports are exempt from tariff, so we can still export our products, although there's much lower share than the past. But there is a risk that, as there is anxiety over disputes like Northern Ireland, that the agri-food sector may be brought into that conflict in time. Another risk we see at the moment is that there are different currencies. So recently we've seen a sterling depreciate against the euro, increasing the costs of living crisis in Britain, and increasing the cost of Irish exporters doing business in Britain. But I guess on the plus side, Irish agri-food exports are much more diversified now than they were when Ireland left the United Kingdom a long time ago. And indeed, agri-food is a relatively small share of our exports. Britain, I guess like Ireland, when we left the UK, is facing a difficult period on leaving the bigger, more stable economic entity. In the last year, the UK is the only G7 country that hasn't recovered its level of economic activity from before the COVID crisis. And the currency devaluation has made the cost of buying goods by consumers larger. So I guess the lesson from that is, while in the long run maybe things are fine, in the short run things can be difficult when you leave a wider economic entity. So to conclude, Ireland and Irish agriculture in the 1920s looked more like a developing country than a modern wealthy country that we now live in. Very many farmers lived at subsistence levels with low standards of living and very low cash, much like their equivalents in developing countries today. As a country, our living standards were dominated by primary agricultural production with minimal added value. And our trade was dominated by our former colonial master, again very similar to many developing countries. But yet, despite a decade of turmoil, it was really remarkable that the production of food was so stable during what was a very turbulent decade, with a war of independence and a civil war and other economic challenges that occurred during that decade. Thank you very much.